morning, everybody. Thank you for coming early in the morning on a San Francisco day. Really appreciate you here. We are very excited to talk about what might otherwise be a deeply nerdy topic, which is how are we integrating privacy controls into the NIST framework for national security systems. So today, I am joined by my colleagues from CIA and the Department of Energy, and we are going to talk about the work that we have been doing to build out an integrated set of privacy and security controls for systems that are processing personally identifiable information. So about 2 years ago, shortly after NIST issued its NIST 853 Rev 5 on security controls, where they integrated the privacy controls directly into that, we started at the Committee for National Security Systems to develop an updated version of our guidance for systems that any national security systems, not making a distinction between systems that process PII and processes that don't, and systems that do not process PII. And so in order to do that work, we stood up under the Safeguarding Working Group, a privacy sub-working group that was made up of about 12 interdisciplinary experts in both privacy and security. And for the first year, year and a half, we spent 2 hours every Monday walking our way through NIST 853, every one of the controls, and discussing whether that should be in the privacy baseline, how we should approach this task of ensuring that we are identifying the right controls to protect personally identifiable information. And the goal of this is really to ensure that our systems are both protecting privacy and improving cybersecurity. Because sometimes what we see, particularly in today's data environment, is people think they don't have PII. They don't think they have information about human beings. And so then they don't put the right controls in place. And this can have catastrophic effects when you suddenly lose that data. And in the national security systems, that can be a major impact. And so for this reason, we really took up this work. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk you through the process of both the privacy baselines that now exist for national security systems, and then we're going to talk about the privacy overlays. These are for systems that process PII. And we're going to talk about how those work within the risk management framework at the end. We'll go for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about, or I guess 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And if you haven't come up with a question, we have plenty for these fabulous presenters. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Karen to start us off.
So as we walk through this today, there are 3 takeaways I want you to have. First, that the federal government is focused on protecting privacy and PII. This CNSSI document is just one way of doing it. That the document we're going to talk about today really creates a layered approach to safeguarding privacy. And the document seeks to expressly bring stakeholders to the table to make decisions about how to safeguard PII. And that's something that the previous document did not do. So, CNSSI, Security Categorization and Control Selection for National Security Systems. It gives us guidance on the first 2 steps of the risk management framework, that select and categorize. It contains your security and privacy baseline controls for national security systems. And it also provides guidance on tailoring, developing and applying overlays, as well as perimeter values, which are set by each agency depending on individual systems. So big changes to CNSSI. First of all, the document was published last July. It accounts for modifications, right, made in 853 Rev 5. You may know that this document departs from NIST because we do not adopt the FIPS high watermark in applying, in categorizing in CNSSI. We have something called privacy implementation controls. You'll see that when you read the document, not if, when, because I know you're going to sit down next week and read the document. So I'm not supposed to call it PIC, but it's just easy to do. But a privacy implementation control is, let's say you have a security control that you need to use. Let's use an MP control from MP, media protection. And you have to put a camera somewhere, that's the control. Right? Once you put that control up, you may likely have a privacy issue stemming from that, from the use of that control. So anytime a control that you're using for security pulls in or creates a possible need for privacy, a privacy control, that's when you may need a PIC. And in the IC, you would go to your senior agency officer for privacy to discuss whether you need to apply a privacy control because of the security control you're using in a particular system. One big change in the Rev 5 of CNSSI is you will see in several places in the document that decisions regarding PII determinations require that you go to the senior agency officer for privacy or a designee. It can be a designee, but we definitely want stakeholders to pull in that person with the privacy expertise before making privacy decisions, because as Becky commented, sometimes you get an accurate, right, determination, sometimes you don't. Privacy or PII is very gray, and it's hard for, PII is one of those things that can be looked at from different perspectives and you land upon different answers. So we just want to make sure that the privacy professional is in the room. So let's look at, looks like I'm advancing through these quite quickly. All right, so baseline controls. Baseline controls help manage enterprise level privacy risks. So you're not talking about the privacy risks that apply to a particular information system. You're talking about those organizational privacy risks. So all your AC1, your IR1, all are going to be baseline controls, right? Your 1 controls are those policies. AC1, every agency must have policy regarding access controls. All of your 1s are going to be baseline. If you look at the updated CNSS 1253 document, you'll see that we've added a privacy baseline column. So you can actually open the document from your phones, look in the document, and go through and see all of the controls that are selected for the privacy baseline. Some of them sync up to controls that were also selected for the security baseline, but that's a new column. Baseline controls is where we start. All national security systems, whether they contain PII or not, should have the baseline controls. And as you know, the baseline is going to come in before any privacy overlay is applied or any tailoring. You may or may not know that attached to CNSSI are several overlays, right? So privacy is just one. So first step, baseline controls. Next step, you look at your overlays, including privacy overlay. So here's one of the baseline controls. This is awareness and training. And you'll see the side by side selected for CNSS privacy baseline. It's pretty consistent with NIST in this case, except when it comes to HE6. And sometimes we sync up with NIST, sometimes we do not. Now, we did get some questions that came in, and one of the questions was, why have 2 different frameworks? And it's actually not a different framework. So the CNSS controls grow out of your NIST controls. Of course, when you're assessing data, or when you're running your risk management assessment, you start with what type of data do you have? And later on in the question answer period, we'll get into a discussion about why we don't apply just NIST 853 to national security systems. And I think that is, let me go into the next slide, I'm sorry. Privacy baseline versus the overlay. So I did explain that the privacy baseline is going to apply to all national security systems. The next step is if you have PII, you're going to want to run an assessment as to the sensitivity level of that PII and then apply a privacy overlay. Once you get to the selection process, as I mentioned, you may pull in controls that actually implicate other privacy controls. So you'll look at the privacy implementation, consideration controls. It's very much a layered approach. You have your baseline, you have your privacy overlay, you have your privacy implementation controls, and there's another set of controls that Andy will discuss, privacy enhancing. So one of the things that I do in my position as a senior agency officer for privacy and civil liberties at CIA is work with stakeholders to assess systems. And this slide is just showing you the difference between a system that is processing PII and is not processing PII. Again, the revision 5 is going to require baseline on all NSS. If it processes PII, then you are going to have to apply the overlay. And those are just the initial 2 considerations. And so I'm going to turn the slides over to Andy. And she's going to go through all of the new overlays that you will see in Rev 5 of CNSSI.
Okay, good morning. So as Karen said, that I'm going to be mentioning or talking a little bit about the privacy overlays. Purpose of the privacy overlays is to recognize that the systems that process PII have all sorts of varying different privacy risks. And so there's different overlays that apply depending upon the privacy risk of the system. It's intended to also support compliance with federal privacy requirements. So the CNSS group, we identified 4 different overlays: an accountability, low, moderate, and high overlay, and then you have your extra credit optional privacy enhancing overlay. And each overlay adds additional controls to increase the number of controls based on the sensitivity of the PII that we're intending to protect. Okay, so we created 2 brand new terms, 2 brand new overlays in this document that did not previously exist. We have an accountability overlay, and then we have a privacy enhancing overlay. So the accountability overlay is intended to recognize that information to account for system users or audit logs is actually PII. And that's a little bit of a shift and a change. This information is tracked to users and particular people. It'll show things like where they're logging in, what time they're logging in, general user activity. That's all PII. And so we developed this accountability overlay to account for the security risk or the privacy risks in that information. I like to think of maybe like a weapon system, right? It doesn't really process PII generally for mission purposes, but you're gonna have this accountability information. So this accountability overlay would apply to that type of system. And then the other brand new overlay that we have is the privacy enhancing overlay. So this is our extra credit one. This is composed of controls that we did not select as mandatory for any number of reasons. Maybe we couldn't tie the control to a particular legal or policy requirement. Maybe the control was really, really resource intensive as relative to the privacy protecting that we would get from it. But we also thought these controls, we wanted to highlight them because we do think that they can significantly enhance privacy. So these are sort of optional controls that can be tailored in depending upon system need or resources. So in terms of how we allocated the controls to the privacy overlays, I'm not gonna lie, this was a very rigorous and manual process. We went control by control. So basically what we did is we looked at all the controls that had not already been selected for the privacy control baseline. Privacy control baseline controls, they're already in the system, so they're already gonna apply. So we looked at those remaining controls that not had been selected, and we asked, is the control needed to maintain accountability of system access or use? If so, then that control went into the accountability baseline, to the accountability overlay. Because of the way that the controls build upon one another, all the controls that went into the accountability overlay also got added to the low, moderate, and high overlays. Then again, we looked what controls are remaining that have not been selected, and we asked, is it necessary to implement the control to meet a policy-related legal or policy requirement? Those controls, then we added to the low, moderate, and high. Then we did another scrub, remaining controls. Is it necessary to protect, to establish safeguards to protect against substantial harm? In that case, we added it to the moderate and the high. And then we looked at whether or not the control would be needed to prevent severe or catastrophic harm. And if so, we added that to the high overlay. Again, that's the overlay intended to protect the most sensitive PII systems. In terms of how we selected controls for the privacy enhancing overlay, we again looked at the controls that we had not selected as mandatory for any of the overlays or the baseline. And we asked, is this a control that we want to make as optional? Is something that we really think could enhance security and that could be tailored into the control matrix? If so, then we went ahead and put that in the privacy enhancing control. Again, it highlights additional controls that can be selected as an option where resources and privacy enhancing requirements exist. Okay, so one of the things that I really liked about our approach, especially coming from a smaller intelligence component, is the fact that we were really mindful of the resource impact that these controls will have. Every control that we would select for privacy, we understood has some sort of a resource tail or a resource impact to it. So we wanted to make sure that we were being really focused on that, minimizing the resource impact while at the same time really protecting privacy. So what we did, after we had allocated all the different controls to the overlays, we took another look at them and we compared them to controls that were already required in the security overlays, that were already mandatory in those overlays. And we asked, is there other security controls? If the privacy control was added and there was not already required by security, we asked, are there other security controls that are required that would achieve that same privacy protection? And can we select those controls already that are already required instead of mandating a separate privacy requirement? It didn't always work. There's some privacy controls that you're just going to have, but we were able to sort of look at what's already required and can we sort of align with those security requirements. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about the different overlays to try to give you an idea of the quantity and type of controls that we selected. So for the accountability overlay, we selected 91 additional controls. Again, because of the way that the controls build upon one another, these controls also applied to the low, moderate, and high overlays. Some examples are account management and enforcement type of controls, so who has access to account management, audit log type information, how is it being shared, those sorts of limiting controls. We added some additional training controls. So for example, training and awareness on insider threat, social engineering, and advanced persistent threats. We also added a number of controls from the PT family. So PT is the PII, processing and transparency family. Some of those controls were already in the privacy baseline, but we went through to see, again, recognizing accountability information is PII, so we added in several of those controls as well. For the low privacy overlay, we added in 30 additional controls. Again, because of the way that the overlays build upon one another, those controls were then also added to the moderate and high overlays. So the low privacy overlay, some of the controls that we added in include access control and encryption for mobile devices that process PII, termination of access for personnel who have been transferred or terminated and no longer have a need to access PII. We added in some additional cryptography and boundary protections. And then we also added in a control related to de-identification in order to minimize PII in the systems. For the moderate privacy overlay, we added in an additional 49 controls. Again, these controls were also added to the high overlay. These controls included stronger account management controls, requirements for audit logs, so for example, proactive reviews of audit logs, analysis of audit logs, correlation of logs across different systems. We also added in some multi-factor authentication requirements for privileged accounts. We added in controls related to alternative work sites. And my favorite, which always engendered a large debate, was data tagging got added into the moderate privacy overlay. And then finally, for the high privacy overlay, we added in 5 additional controls. Probably the most sensitive or the most substantial being penetration testing. Again, the high privacy overlay is intended to protect systems with the highest risk PII. And the way that when we added in these controls is that the high privacy overlay is going to have the most number of controls because we're looking to protect the most sensitive systems, whereas systems that process a little bit less sensitive PII that you would apply the accountability or low overlays, those had fewer controls. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Becky to talk a little bit about the risk management framework.
Thank you. Oh, perfect. All right. So what we wanted to do now is just give you a sense of how does this work within the risk management framework? Where exactly are we as we're thinking about the security and privacy controls in place? So again, NIST 853 and then CNSSI 1253 are both talking about that categorize and select portion. So that's the steps where we are there. So I'm going to quickly walk through a few of these slides so that because they're easier to sort of build upon one. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the impact values. So what is the impact of the PII that is being selected? And this is for all the data. And so we start with that, and then we are going to categorize the system. So based on the impact values, we're going to make some decisions in terms of, are we at an accountability PII? Are we going to have, or are we going to be at a low, moderate, or high in that process? Based on those 2 decisions, we're going to go ahead and move to that next step, which is select the security controls. And then we're going to actually refine those. So this is where you might decide, I no longer need this control, or because of the data, I do need this control, or maybe I want to add something from the privacy enhancing one. This is where you're doing that. And this is where what Karen talked about is really integrating what the work is of the privacy officials and the security officials to make sure that those decisions are based on the type of PII that's going to be processed in the system. All right, so let's take a step back a little bit and talk about what we're doing here, right? So in your normal sort of security process, you select the impact values. And so from a privacy perspective, what we're going to be doing is asking, does this system process PII for business, mission, or administrative needs? So if the answer to that question is yes, then the next step will be to determine the privacy risk level and use the privacy risk factors that are outlined in the CNSSI document to determine where are we on the scale based on the type of PII that we have here. Then the next step will be you would apply the appropriate privacy overlay with the control set. So remember, the privacy overlays are on top of the existing baseline. So these are for systems that process PII. Oops, wrong way. And then your next step would be to select the appropriate, any type of optional or additional privacy controls that need to be in place based on any of the specifics associated with your system. Now, what happens if instead you answer, no, my system is not processing any PII that's for business, mission, administrative needs. So this is not sort of my core function. Let's go with Andy's example of it's a weapons system. The weapons system is not processing PII, but it may, in fact, have information about who accessed the system, when they accessed the system, what they were doing on the system, in order to have accountability for how that system is used in case something goes amiss. So in that instance, then, we have created the accountability PII. And this is sort of a very basic level of controls in order to protect the PII associated with your accountability, your audit logs, your account management information, which frequently what we have found, at least in the national security environment, is that folks would sort of dismiss this type of information as being PII. They might refer to it as, oh, that's just sort of, contact information. I don't need to worry about that information. But what we have found over time as different types of privacy breaches occur or different types of cybersecurity incidents happen, those particular PII are pretty useful to hackers who want to hack into the system. If they can take on those controls associated with my account management, that's pretty useful for them. And so we want to make sure that we're properly protecting and acknowledging that data needs the protection. So that's what's new in this PII accountability section. So you hit that, and then we go back up to our step 4, or I guess it's the second step of the select. You're going to pick the overlays and go forward. Now, there's a recognition that there may in fact be some systems that do not actually have any type of account management on them. We're not really sure what they are, and we're looking forward to finding out. And so as we start the process, we will be interested to see what are the systems that has no type of login. And I am sure, there probably are missile silos or other things that have some sort of technology, but they don't have the accountability. We're not sure what they are yet, but we're going to be looking forward to it. And because everybody always has an exception, we wanted to make sure we were accounting for that. So that concludes our brief presentation on how we have approached building privacy controls into the national security systems. We're happy to take questions, but I'm going to start by asking our panelists first. If you have a question, please come up to the middle, and we'll be happy to take that. So let me start with you, Karen. Can you tell me who has to use the CNSSI?
So CNSSI 1253 just applies to all national security systems. So these are systems that are processing NS data. And that's it.
Is it required for them to use it?
It is required. And there is a lot of tailoring that goes on, right? So CNSS can be a base level. You're going to tailor to your system and mission needs. But yes, it is required.
So I wonder, Andy, we talked a little bit about NIST. We talked a little bit about CNSS. We mentioned a little bit about the differences. Are these two frameworks, one framework? How do we think about these? And why do we need 2 or 3 or 4 privacy frameworks?
Right, so I would say they're all one framework, right? We're not dealing with 2 different frameworks. The CNSS builds on the NIST frameworks. We use the same NIST controls. We just choose which ones are necessary for national security systems. National security systems, we're processing incredibly sensitive types of PII based on the context of what we're doing. And so we recognize that as necessary to create additional controls or be specific to the context for which we're looking to protect privacy. I also did want to note, this is just one way that we protect privacy in our national security systems. We're subject to all sorts of other different types of oversight requirements. So this is specific to information systems, but it's sort of a layered approach on how, we look at privacy overall in the intelligence community and for national security systems.
That is a great point. I wonder, Karen, do we need, what's special about national security systems? Is there something that's different about the national security system that led us to sort of walk through this process?
So the data, right? The data is very different. Let's just start with that. Also, it's a federal system. So the one difference between the federal government and the folks outside of the federal government is that we have requirements like the Privacy Act, right, of 1974, which dictates how the federal government has to handle PII it's processing, right? This law doesn't apply on the outside. We have other authorities within the IC, 12333, PPD. So our document, 1253, recognizes those differences within the Intel agency. One of the other things that I find folks outside of Intel don't know is really like how we got our jobs. So our jobs are born from, we call Section 803. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission published a report, and it says that the government has to have more, I wish I had the quote here, but essentially the government has to have more contact with our lives. And since the government has to have more contact in order to keep us safe, there have to be safeguards. And so there's an act coming out of that 9/11 Commission that establishes privacy and civil liberties offices within the IC. So these are relatively new positions. And our jobs, my job specifically at my agency, is to help stakeholders, help ensure that they implement those privacy and civil liberties protections so that they don't intrude on our rights as they run mission. So just about everything we do stems from that, right? So that's the big difference between a NIST and a 1253 document. It's going to recognize the laws that pertain to us, the authorities that pertain to us, and frankly, the data is highly sensitive. In case of a breach, right, the damage is just different. It's damage to the individual, the agency, national security, the nation.
And I just want to sort of riff on that too. I think another really key distinction of the type of data that we're dealing with is we can't, in the intelligence community, based on the nature of what we do, we can't always get consent, right? We can't ask you, can we please run some sort of counterintelligence sort of issue. So you don't have those privacy protections that you would normally get with other federal agencies. Usually there's a Privacy Act notice when we collect data. We can't always do that. And so we have to be really, really mindful of the fact that, you know, this is data that doesn't have that built-in privacy protection already. We need to protect it to an even higher level.
That's a great point. And so maybe that leads me to a question. All of this analysis depends on identifying the PII, and certainly we see across any number of countries, jurisdictions, laws, different definitions of what is PII. And I would say that that has shifted over time. And so things that we used to think were not particularly sensitive, everybody always recognizes social security number is sensitive. Although back in the day, it wasn't really. It was just sort of, there was an executive order that said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote an executive order telling all of the federal agencies, you should use the social security number for any time you need to identify a person. And all of us have recognized, particularly as many privacy breaches have occurred, that if you use the social security number over and over for all of these different reasons, it actually increases the risk to the individual's privacy and the likelihood of identity theft.
Let me add this. Technology really drives the definition of PII. It really does. So maybe 50 years ago in IRIS, wouldn't be PII, and I don't know what technology was out 50 years ago. But there was a point when you would, she has blue eyes, she has brown eyes, but you couldn't see the iris, right? Well, now the iris is PII. So when I'm having discussions with folks, I like to put that out there, and they say, well, that means everything is PII. And I'm like, the technology is almost driving us in that direction.
And I think just the great amount of data that's out there, right? Something that we used to say like, oh no, it's de-identified. I have to say this, I went to go buy a car the other day, and they made me download an app. And they said, you need to know it so you know when to charge your car. And I look, and I couldn't turn off my geolocating data. And they're like, don't worry, we assign you a number. So that's not what you want to tell a privacy person, right? But just the vast amount of data that's out there that can be correlated, things that you used to say like, no, and we can try to protect it by de-identifying it, but it doesn't make it a lot of times not PII.
So as I think about sort of the intersection, we're sitting here at a security conference and talking about the privacy issues. One of the things that's really important is, these two disciplines need to work closely together. At the end of the day, we want to ensure that we are protecting the PII in whatever form it is, and ensuring that it is only used for the purposes for which it was collected or determined was appropriate for that collection. And that means we need to work together. And so when we think about privacy, we often think about some of the more sort of interactive aspects with the human being whose data we have. We think about in non-national security systems giving someone a notice or giving someone some sort of choice. But in the security side, we think about, well, did I protect the information? And there often can be a space there where our security colleagues or other mission people do not want to consider the data to be PII because they think they're getting out of some set of requirements. And that's the space where we really want to engage, where we want to make sure folks are thinking about the privacy aspects, because if we haven't thought about the risk of that data, it's going to mean that when it gets lost, we're going to have a lot bigger impact in that space. And so the reason we really work on the privacy side to identify what's the information, can it easily be identified back to a human being, is not because we want to add extra requirements to anybody. It's because we want to make sure that we've properly, held that data and are doing what we were expected to do with that. I want to pause and see, does anybody out there have questions? It's not often that you have somebody from CIA, Department of Energy, or ODNI sitting up here happily talking about things publicly.
Hi. Last October, the EU and the US negotiated a data transfer framework.
Yes.
And as part of that, the President published an executive order which requires the intelligence community to update signal intelligence procedures to protect privacy. Does that have anything to do with what you're talking about now, or are they completely separate? And secondly, could you just talk a little bit more about what prompted this process that you guys have just gone through?
Absolutely. So Executive Order 14086, the Data Privacy Framework, was signed by President Biden in October, as you mentioned. That particular framework talks about having a set of specific procedures that each of the intelligence community elements will have for how they have to handle data that is collected either through signals intelligence or was originally signals intelligence. And so both of these, we've been reviewing them on behalf for ODNI, and those will be published in the coming weeks. Those are those high policy frameworks that both Karen and Andy talked about as examples of, there are high level policy frameworks. When we get down to the CNSS type work, this is, I have an IT system and I'm going to put these controls in place. And so when you think about the fact that we said we're going to protect non-US persons in signals intelligence, that means as those information flow down into an IT system, we need to make sure that the CNSS is appropriately, that they've picked the right controls for that IT system associated with the privacy. And so the PII is that determining factor in that space. So this is how it's sort of the distinction between high-level principles and boots on the ground. Karen is working with somebody's IT system and she's saying, put this AT6 control in order to protect the privacy of this particular data. So those are the distinctions. We have 1 year on the executive order procedures to issue those. We're likely to do those hopefully sooner. I had publicly a couple weeks ago mentioned that it would be after April 28th, which is this coming Friday, when we will be releasing the ODNI's annual statistical transparency report. This is a report having to do with how the intelligence community uses national security laws to both protect civil liberties and privacy and protect national security. And it will happen before October 7th, which is the 1 year date that is there. There are also a variety of requirements for redress that are also being put forward in that space. So thank you for the question.
I also want to address the other part of your question and piggyback what Becky said. So definitely system controls, but also remember that the document is going to offer up those enterprise controls, right? So how to establish incident response. All of those things are critical, your training. So when you look at the document, when you read it, go ahead and sit down and look at the PT family, which is a new family, right? But also look at incident response and take yourself down that privacy overlay columns and the baseline columns and track back to the language in 853 to get a sense for that layered approach, because those are the rules that are offering the IC elements of that layered approach. You also asked why? What prompted? I just think because the Rev 4 was from 2014, right? And if you think back to 2014, if we think people don't understand PII now, maybe they hadn't heard of it in 2014, right? So technology in the past almost 10 years has just drastically changed. There's some other EOs you can look at that came out in the past. This is 2023, so I'd say like 2 to 3 years. Protecting America's American sensitive data from adversaries, NSM, Presidential Memorandum, NSM 8. So you'll see that the federal government is really focused on a 360 approach to cybersecurity, including protecting PII
Yeah, so I
and
want to make
updates to documents.
Yeah, the point, so Rev 4 really changed to Rev 5, right? NIST 853 Rev 4, we had a appendix for privacy control, Appendix J, right? Not even A, Appendix J. When NIST 853 Rev 5 came out, they actually included the privacy controls instead of tucking it in the back. We put it right up front, so it's like up there with the same security controls. And so that really dictated a need for us as this recognition of, you know, PII is so much more important. You know, we really need to be protecting privacy. That, I think that was a large driver as well, is to recognize that, like, just very structural change and increasing the amount of privacy controls that we have.
The interesting part was actually CNSSI had issued privacy overlays back in 2015. So they were a little bit ahead of where NIST was. So they had a set of overlays to say, oh, if we have PII, we'll sort of do this. What those overlays, though, had was what we called the Rolodex exception. And this is what got subsumed instead by our new accountability PII, because we recognized that a lot of people were saying, oh, this data isn't very high risk. It's just contact information. It's just all the audit logs. There's nothing interesting here. And that was where we were seeing some of the different places where vectors for people to sort of get into systems. And so that was a sort of real update to that space. I think, you know, sort of we build upon one another, and so, you know, NIST, I think what we've done here with the CNSS is build up to that next level in terms of privacy, and I anticipate sort of NIST will still come along there. We have a little bit more flexibility because we're dealing with national security systems. We also have higher risks with some of those because of the type of PII that's in there. And so as we think about things like how are we going to holistically think about the risk to the data, what are some of those factors in that space? Historically, that's been in NIST 837, which just talks about it from the confidentiality perspective. So when we think about NIST security, it's confidentiality, integrity, availability, and they only were putting privacy into that sort of confidentiality space. And the reality is it really hits all three. And so we've now just taken that out and said, nope, we're going to go ahead and think about what's the risk to privacy based on the type of data, the volume of the data, who it could possibly impact. And so we've continued to evolve that thinking really in mind with who's our audience. It's our mission people and our security folks who need to be able to identify they have PII and they're protecting it at the right level. Because no one likes a privacy incident. There is nothing fun about a privacy incident. And they come in all shapes and sizes, but they always have an impact that's not positive. Other questions? If not, I'm going to ask you a question, unless you want to. Go ahead.
No, definitely ask me a question, but I think he asked about foreign data. I believe in the CNSSI 1253 document, you can find a mention of foreign data in that, maybe that page 1. Look at the first 2 pages of that document.
Which hasn't been issued yet, so. Oh, no, maybe.
No, the
baseline
one
Yeah,
published,
baseline
not
is
the privacy
published.
overlay. the
Overlay
main
is not.
document.
Privacy are very close.
Very close. Okay. So the Federal CIO and Federal Privacy Council both issued, and maybe this is actually for Andy, but issued a privacy collaboration index.
Sure did.
And but in what we see in the CNSSI is you and Karen both talked about a privacy implementation considerations. Could you explain the difference between those two things and why we have so many PIC, PCI things?
Becky, I would love to, because I love the privacy implementation considerations. I think this is one of the most interesting things that we did, because I think it really recognizes that sometimes some security controls that you're implementing for security purposes are going to create a privacy risk. Karen had a really good example of cameras that you're putting in. Yep, in the media protection family. There's also, like, we could talk about wireless intrusion devices, which I don't really want to, but I could, or insider threat, right? So these are types of ways that these controls create privacy risk. So basically what we're saying is when you want to implement this control security for security purposes, come and talk to us. Like, let's do it in a way that best protects privacy. The privacy collaboration index is a little bit different. That one is basically security and privacy have to work together in order to implement the control as it's meant to be implemented in order to protect privacy and security.
And so when you look at the Privacy Collaboration Index, it's a way to think about, is the security person implementing it or is the privacy person implementing it? When you think about the privacy implementation considerations, it's the security people most likely implementing it, but it's coming to talk to the privacy people to make sure that they haven't accidentally tripped across a bunch of privacy requirements in that space. And so they do two different things but have all the same letters, so it can be a little confusing at times. All right. So as we, looking at, so Karen, can you talk, you've talked about this a little bit, but as we're sort of coming in for a landing here, can you talk a little bit about what are the outcomes we're hoping to achieve by the issuance of CNSSI 1253 privacy baseline and overlays?
I mean, so security and privacy in the new document, I feel like they're married, and we want them to stay married. They were very separate, right, in Revision 4. And when you read through the new document, they come together. So we hope that they come together and stay together. Also, there's several places in the document that ask security professionals to seek out the assistance of the senior agency officer for privacy or a designee. It's really, the document really pushes people to come together to make these decisions. Yesterday, a Cybersec person came over to me and said, privacy really is security. Why is it separate? So I did explain to her that we're trying to marry them. We're trying to keep them together. But in people's minds, you need a security professional and a privacy professional, right? But privacy engineers are proving that maybe we can have one person who does all of that work. So this document really seeks to marry it, to create collaboration, to layer the approach to privacy. Because again, the baseline hits all NSS. And there are privacy protections in the baseline. Like the AC controls are some of the best privacy controls, that access, right? But then if you have PII, and depending on the sensitivity, you have to apply the overlay. So it's really just shoring up a layered approach to making sure that the organization and the system, right, as well as the individuals handling the data, are remembering that privacy is critical as we run mission. We just have, I almost said way too many authorities, but we have a lot of authorities on our data. It's just very different than it is doing privacy on the outside. And 1253 and the overlay in particular recognizes that.
Do you want to have any closing thoughts, Andy?
Well, if we have any security people in the room, I would say to sort of what Karen said in terms of work with your privacy people. We want to work with you, right? Like, and the sooner you talk to your privacy people, the better off you're going to be, because then we can build in, you know, these controls at the onset, right? As you're building the system, let's build in the privacy. So, yeah, so, and I think that's a really important piece, is just kind of like work together. Let's get together.
And we have oversight. So we want to be in your lives.
We
want
really
you to be
do.
in our lives.
And don't try to avoid having PII. Maybe the takeaway from this conversation, which is, if you're trying to avoid saying you have PII, take a step back and think about what it is you're scared about. Why do you not want to go find your privacy person? Because at the end of the day, all of us have, the same sort of goal in mind, which is you want to make sure the data has been protected correctly. You want to make sure that you aren't losing the data, that the data isn't improperly, isn't misused, abused, or lost. And security professionals and privacy professionals want those same sorts of things. And so if you're scared about the requirements, if you're concerned about what sort of is being put onto you, then have those conversations, because at the end of the day, none of us want to have lost the PII. It's a lot more expensive. So with that, unless anybody has a last question, I'll say thank you to everybody. We appreciate you coming to ours, and our slides will be are online as well.
I also want to invite you, if you have more questions about how we protect privacy in the IC, to take a look at CIA's website Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties. There'll be some documents there that will explain the authorities that drive our office.
Yes. All right. Thank you.